If you've ever wondered what it was like in the Wild Wild West, don't worry, you're not alone. I can't say I've ever thought of being like a Western gal, but after watching stereotypes come to life in old movies, I'm quite curious about the truth versus the fiction. Let's lasso up some facts together, shall we? Please don't click off, I promise I'll stop with the bad jokes. When a story attracted public anger, some settlers in the West were quick to take the law into their own hands. These vigilantes were idolized in popular contemporary accounts, but the justice they served was often brutal and inhumane by most standards. Not content with apprehension and execution, most vigilantes physically tormented any accused. Some folks even took trophies. In 1891, the skin of a sentenced bandit was tanned and made into souvenirs. It's definitely more unique than the usual tacky magnets or door signs, I'll give them that. Vigilantes justified their acts by pointing to the terrible acts that the accused had allegedly committed. Yeah, but to quote my dad, two wrongs don't make a right. Even when the accused were caught and were waiting for trial, vigilante squads didn't always have the patience to wait for a legal sentence or risk an acquittal. Instead, they showed up at the jail and demanded to deal with the offenders themselves. In one 1878 incident, an accused killer was caught, taken to jail, with a trial scheduled for the next day. But during that night, 20 or 30 masked men arrived with weapons in hand and took the man away to deliver their own immediate justice. How? Well, they killed this guy by way of the rope necklace of death. Look, that guy probably wasn't long for this world anyways, since most convictions at the time ended in executions. The life expectancy of somebody who broke the law in the Wild Wild West often decreased dramatically after conviction, especially for those accused of taking another person's life. Whether offenders received an official trial or one carried out by the unsanctioned vigilantes, folks demanded justice. In California, offenders were convicted in very quick trials and usually met the end of their life at the county courthouse. Execution usually came shortly after conviction, as appeals and stays of execution were uncommon. If an expected execution did not happen or did not occur quickly enough for the crowd, that's where you've got your vigilantes that I was speaking about a moment ago. I know in one 1851 case, vigilantes convicted a man of stealing gold dust and gave him a simple little 3 hours to get his affairs in order before they ended his life. Like, I don't know about you, but that's not enough time to get my affairs in order. I have too much junk. Law enforcement was still a job during vigilante time, but death in the line of duty was pretty likely. The West had a variety of legitimate lawmen, ranging from town sheriffs and marshals to the U.S. Marshals appointed by the Attorney General. U.S. Marshals were charged with maintaining federal law, and they could deputize local men to form a posse when greater numbers were necessary. And during this period, deaths in the line of duty were kinda common. The U.S. Marshals alone had several deadly incidents. In 1872, a marshal and 7 members of his posse were fatally harmed when they tried to take a prisoner from the custody of another court. In 1885, a deputy marshal and 3 members of his posse engaged in a deadly firing exchange. A prisoner escape claimed the lives of a deputy marshal and 2 posse members in 1887. Another did the same to 2 deputy marshals and 1 posse member in 1893. The West still holds a lot of records for the deadliest incidents involving multiple law enforcement casualties. Not records I want to see broken anytime soon, mind you. Contrary to what you might think after all that, many towns did indeed try to enforce weapon control and restrictions. The Wild West had no shortage of fireable weapons, creating a worrying situation for lawmen trying to prevent violent offenses. Towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas required visitors to surrender their weapons whenever they entered the town. In fact, the 1881 firing exchange event at the OK Corral started as a conflict over Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers refusing to give up their weapons when they entered Tombstone. Anyone defying a western town's weapon control laws was likely to meet a violent end. Author and cowboy Andy Adams describes the laws of Dodge City in his account published in 1903. The buffalo hunters and rangemen have protested against the iron rule of Dodge's peace officers, and nearly every protest has cost human life. Don't ever get the impression that you can ride your horses into a saloon or fire out the lights in Dodge. It may go somewhere else, but it don't go there. Most cowboys think it's an infringement on their rights to give up firing in town, and if it is, it stands. For your weapons are no match for Winchesters and buckshot, and Dodge's officers are as game a set of men as ever faced danger. Look, I know weapons control is something law enforcement still struggles to enforce till this day, so interesting to see how that goes. So even with law enforcement being a thing, corruption was kinda rampant. The West had many problems with vigilante justice, but the legitimate lawmen were sometimes not much better. Many law enforcement officers were not consistently paid, earning money only through taking a percentage of fines or collecting bounties on wanted men. In desperate times, some lawmen turned to crime themselves, making corruption a big problem. Sheriff Dave Allison was accused several times of misappropriation of money. Henry Newton Brown was a deputy sheriff tasked with tracking people for a bounty, but on his bounty hunt, he robbed a bank with 3 accomplices. A vigilante mob took matters into their own hands though, enacting fatal punishment. So he did get punished, quote unquote. Timothy Longhair Jim Courtright used his position in law enforcement to to run a protection racket that extorted profits from gambling dens and saloons. He died in a duel with somebody else though. Who else? Oh, just a saloon owner who refuses protection. Sadly, racism was a big influence for a lot of crime and crime punishments. In 1862, a period of famine and encroaching white settlement led to conflict between the Sante Sioux and the US military under the direction of General John Pope. When the conflict ended a few months later, hundreds of indigenous folks were taken prisoner and sentenced to death in military trials that lasted around 10 minutes each, so not really long. Most of these prisoners were convicted on the basis of being present when the fighting ended, which, great, let's kill all of our bystanders for no reason. Military authorities wanted to execute all 303 people who were convicted, but President Abraham Lincoln was concerned with distinguishing between individual acts and group warfare, and how executing prisoners of war would look to foreign powers. He approved the execution of only 38 prisoners in the end, still making it the largest mass execution in US history. This was far from the end of indiscriminate executions, as the US government enforced increasingly dehumanizing policies. Generals William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan fought against indigenous groups, viewing those conflicts with the same attitude of total war that they had adopted during the Civil War. Under their direction, the military destroyed entire villages, with Sherman ordering his soldiers to kill everybody in a village and burn it down. And that's just the official folks. Vigilante justice was inherently subject to the biases of the public, which often led to the racially motivated selection of targets. And the West was no exception, with plenty of ethnic minorities considered the other and regarded as a threat by white settlers. So, folks who were Hispanic, indigenous, and Chinese were frequent targets of vigilante acts. In 1878, Juan de la Cruz was accused of attacking a woman and a young human while, boozing. The victims were unharmed in the incident, but public anger turned against La Cruz and a mob seized the attacker from jail, and he met his way by the end of the rope necklace. When the body was found, one witness reportedly said, "You've done a good job, you reformers. Now why don't you hang the man who sold the whiskey to the Indian?" His words, not mine, but it just gives you an idea of how things were at the time. Ever heard of army camels? So in 1855, the US Army decided to import camels to Texas. The wide open spaces of the West were well suited for them, so they were like, yeah, let's bring in 75 camels from the Middle East. They worked at Camp Verde, where they made supply runs to San Antonio. But a few years later, the Civil War disrupted the service when a government official decided to auction off the animal, and the new owners sent some of them to Nevada, some to California, and other ones were just sort of set free. Now at first you didn't really see them around, but in the 1880s, Arizona Territory faced a terrible menace known as the Red Ghost. What did it do? Well, it trampled one woman, whereas another story claimed the monster ate a grizzly bear. When miners spotted the Red Ghost and fired at it, a human skull fell from the creature's back. After years of terrorizing Arizona, eventually it was taken out. What was it? Just a feral camel. Now camel sightings in the West continued into the 20th century, which is so wild. Like imagine just going about your day, damn, a camel. Time to talk about a famous criminal. Billy the Kid was wanted in 1881 for shooting a sheriff in Nebraska and another man in a New Mexico saloon. Running from a $500 bounty on his head, he was eventually trapped and put on trial. And it didn't go the way he wanted. The judge found Billy guilty, saying the outlaw would hang until he was dead, dead, dead. Billy responded, "You can go to hell, hell, hell." How poetic. His date with the gallows set, Billy pulled off a daring escape. On April 28th of 1881, he asked the deputy guarding his jail cell to take him to the outhouse. Once free from the cell, the outlaw pulled off his handcuffs, took the deputy's firearm, and did away with the deputy. Knowing the sheriff would be after him, Billy hid on the roof of the courthouse. When the sheriff ran up, Billy yelled, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get," and then fired on the sheriff. His escape nearly complete, he took a horse and hit the road and got away. Well, that time. We all know how the rest of the story played out. Feuding families were a doozy and a half back in the day. The Kentucky-West Virginia border's world-famous Hatfield and McCoy families weren't the only notorious feuding clans of the old days. In fact, the Old West had a feud that went even further than that infamous incident. After the Civil War, Texas had two families, the Suttons and the Taylors, who really didn't like each other. The feud started when Buck Taylor fired at and killed a Sutton Alley in 1866, then escalated with the deaths of Taylor and a man named Dick Chisholm. 2 years later, in a horse sale gone wrong. Taylor's remaining family members dug in their heels. They had Southern pride and were mad about the Confederacy losing decisively in the Civil War. The Suttons, meanwhile, had the backing of local Texas militia members and state police outfits that were keen on Reconstruction. The Sutton family's patriarch, William, took control of the police himself by 1869, running raids across the state to ferret out cattle rustlers sympathetic to the Taylors. Over the next 5 years, all of DeWitt County, Texas was plunged into a horrifically violent feud. Even members of other families were forced to take sides and choose. Those who didn't offer allegiance risked being killed. Then again, those who did pick a team were killed in skirmishes and senseless violence as well. By 1874, so many people had died in DeWitt County that the Texas Rangers finally rode in and worked for months to ease tensions. They were mostly unsuccessful, but by the end of 1875, the feud started to slow down. And it wasn't because of anybody's really great negotiating skills. It was just because the most aggressive and vicious participants on each side had met their end. Because of everything else I've already covered today, it should come as a surprise to nobody that homicide rates in the Wild West were extremely high, rivaled only by the violence of the American South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. An adult living in Dodge City, Kansas from 1876 to 1885 stood a 1 in 61 chance of not surviving. If you lived in San Francisco, you had a 1 in 203 chance of a similarly rough end, and if you lived in other counties in California, 1 in 72. Oregon? 1 in 208. Still not great, but not awful.
The Old West had some wild hygienics and some that may or may not make sense. For example, not all beds in the American West were made of straw and hay, but many were. Such bedding wasn't changed often, leading to infestations by lice and other critters. Lice, or seam squirrels, were just one of the troublesome groups of insects that could make life in the Wild West less than hygienic. If you were a soldier during the Wild West times, our mattresses at the early frontier army posts consist of a cotton bag stuffed with straw, which was nicknamed prairie feathers. The straw was supposedly to be changed once a month, and files found that their way into food stuffings and human waste. Mosquitoes flocked into poorly insulated buildings, and as one member named Rose Pender, a visitor to the American West from 1883 to 1888, recalled one night when she tried to sleep, bugs abounded, I got very little rest. That was her Yelp review. She gave 3 out of 5 stars. Very few people had screens on windows, so bugs would make their way into homes and outhouses and back again, leaving remnants of whatever they picked up along the way. Not to mention, you'd have to have a chamber pot, as indoor plumbing was not utilized or invented efficiently enough in the Wild West, so you can imagine if you didn't throw out your waste from your chamber pot, considering it was under your bed, it would attract even more insects, bugs, and intensify the acidic odors and smells. Back in the Wild West, people had to get creative when it came to bathroom business, as toilet paper wasn't a thing for a long time, so they had to resort into using corn cobs, torn pages from magazines, and catalogs. It wasn't until 1857 that Joseph Gaiety introduced the medicated paper, but it was sold individually, not on rolls, meaning like 1 sheet each one. Roll-style toilet paper didn't arrive until 1890, along with the invention of the toilet paper holder. Dust storms were a formidable and unavoidable aspect of life in the 1800s American West, and the severity of these storms, as recorded in journals and diaries, often led to eye irritation, respiratory issues, and even livestock fatalities. The pervasiveness of dust and inside homes posed continuous challenges to settlers, affecting their health and living conditions. The impact of this dust storms offers a vivid portrayal of the harsh environmental conditions faced by settlers. It emphasizes the constant battle against natural elements and the resilience required to adapt and survive in each of this challenging landscape. And if you were a cowboy, you might come into town smelling of sweat, dust, blood, or just constantly smelling the way you smell, which included smelling like a horse. The tolerance of such strong odors in public spaces reflected the period, different attitudes towards personal hygienes and social norms, and it underscores the hardship of the cowboy life, where practicalities often overruled concerns for cleanliness. Cowboys of the Wild West, after long stretches on horseback, often carried with them a distinctive and pungent horse odor. The scent often became particularly noticeable when close quarters were made, especially in local bars where cowboys gathered for refreshments, and bartenders, those poor guys, were more concerned of the profit than the smell comfort paid by little minds of their patrons stink as long as they had money. The aspect of a cowboy life offers a realistic glimpse into the less romanticized day-to-day realities of the era, where personal hygiene often took a backseat to the demands of frontier living. And so when it came to showering or bathing, the popularity of public baths reflect on the social and economic realities of the time, where communal solutions were often the only viable options for personal hygiene. It also highlights the challenges of maintaining cleanliness in an era before modern plumbing and sanitation. In the Wild West, public baths emerged as a popular solution for the majority who lacked private bathing facilities. So these communal bathhouses, often through a symbol of cleanliness and socialization, often meant sharing close quarters and even the same bath water with other people. Given the rudimentary nature of soaps at the time, these baths could paradoxically expose patrons to more dirt and bacteria from fellow bathers than they had removed. And so in the Wild West, the lack of antiseptics and unsanitary conditions made even more minor injuries potentially fatal. A simple cut or abrasion could escalate into a serious infection or disease, with settlers especially vulnerable on the trail. This reality emphasizes the constant dangers faced in daily life, where even trivial wounds pose significant health risks. The threat of diseases like cholera from such injuries underlines the harshness of the era and the importance of caution and self-care. It also highlights the limitation of medical knowledge and practices of the time, contributing to the high mortality rates from what we know now easily are treatable conditions. While numbing the pain was a priority, the only solace came in the form of a sweet gulp of whiskey. And the lack of essential dental care resources meant oral hygiene also took a backseat to survival, and a pristine smile was a very rare gem. Toothbrushes were a luxury, and brushing one's teeth was an afterthought for many. And it gets worse, because it always does. When faced with dental issues like cavity or root canals, the remedies were far from sophisticated. Brace yourself, as the favored method was just simply getting barbers and even blacksmiths acting like makeshift dentists and just extracting your offended tooth with pliers. Women in the Wild West were often conspicuous about personal hygienes with their male counterparts, or more than their male counterparts. Despite the challenges of privacy and limited resources, many women made effort to wash regularly, using nearby rivers and streams for basic cleanliness. This practice, alongside the advantage of being indoors, more often allowed them to maintain a higher level of personal hygiene compared to men. This gender difference in hygiene and hygienic practices showcases the early recognition of the importance of cleanliness among women, and it highlights their role in setting standards for personal care, even in a time where bathing and washing were not as so common in a practice. Cowboys and cowgirls of the Wild West era weren't just fashion trendsetters, but their choices of accessories served a dual purposes of practicality and hygiene-wise. Bandanas often provided protections against the gritty winds and scorching suns, and there's also another hidden benefit. In a time when the access to clean water and regular bathing was very limited, personal hygiene practices weren't always up to par, so the bandana, often worn around the neck or face, acted as a makeshift shield. Not only did they safeguard against dust, but they also aided in reducing the spread of germs and unpleasant odors that people so commonly came across the rugged days of the Wild West. And also, if you smelled, at least they can cover it up. In the Wild West, alcohol-fueled bar brawls were common, often escalating to very dangerous levels. The infamous firewater, a potential mix of burnt sugar, alcohol, and chewing tobacco, frequently ignited tempers over trivial matters. While many brawls resulted in minor injuries, some spiraled into deadly conflicts. This volatile environment, where a simple disagreement could lead to lethal outcomes, paint a vivid picture of the lawlessness and rough justice that characterized the era. The prevalence of such violent encounters in saloons highlighted the harsh realities of life in the Wild West, where disputes were often settled with fists or weapons rather than words, underscoring the perilous nature of social interactions during this time. In the 1800s, diseases like cholera, as I mentioned, was a major cause of death in the American frontier. The necessity to prioritize drinking water over uses like laundry and dishwashing exacerbated the risk of disease outbreaks. So cholera in particular claimed thousands of lives, affecting both settlers and indigenous populations. The arrival of European settlers in the Americas had a catastrophic impact on Native American populations, primarily due to the introduction of diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native Americans had no prior exposure or immunity to these diseases, and they had suffered devastating losses, with some estimates indicating a reduction of up to 90% in their populations. This tragic aspect of colonial expansion underscores the lethal impact of infectious diseases in populations without natural immunity, highlighting one of the most significant and tragic consequences of the European settlement of the Americas. This grim reality of the frontier life underscores the vulnerability of populations to common diseases in the absence of modern sanitation and medical knowledge. It highlights the precariousness of life during this period, where everyday resources and practices could also mean the difference between health and widespread illness. The westward expansion of settlers under the banner of manifest destiny had a significant health implication. As they veneered into new territories, they encountered unfamiliar diseases to which they had little immunity due to poor living conditions. This exposure to new pathogens posed a significant health risk, often overwhelming their already compromised immune systems, and this aspect of frontier expansion highlights the unintended consequences of exploration and settlement on the health of the settlers, revealing the challenges and dangers they faced in unfamiliar environments. Hospitals in the 1800s, prior to the understanding of bacteria, often did much harm than good. The lack of sterilization of medical instruments and close patient quarters facilitated the rapid spread of diseases. These medical facilities, intended for healing, ironically, became hotspots for infections and diseases transmissions. The conditions in these early hospitals reflected the limited medical knowledge of the time and the challenges of providing healthcare in an era unaware of basic hygiene principles. It illustrates the paradox of places designed for healing inadvertently becoming centers of illnesses, a stark contrast to the sanitized medical environments of today. Despite the advancements of medical science, some rural doctors in the 1800s continued to use leeches for bloodletting, based on the outdated belief that diseases were caused by excess blood. This practice largely largely abandoned by academic physicians, persisted in smaller towns, highlighting the discrepancies in medical knowledge and practices across different regions. The continued use of leech therapy in some areas served as a reminder of the slow decimation of medical knowledge and the persistence of traditional practices even in the face of emerging scientific understanding. There was a time, of course, a terrifying epidemic known as syphilis swept through a population like wildfire. In a quest for a remedy, medical professions turned into a substance that hold the key: mercury. Despite the severe side effects, patients endured a grueling routine of daily applications of mercury ointment. This reckless treatment could last for years while unleashing many horrors upon the afflicted. However, people who were convinced the treatment was worth it, I guess now we wouldn't practice it the same, but at least we got better in self-care compared to parts of history. The Wild West saloons were the pinnacle rest stop for travelers, gamblers, and drinkers alike. But how gross was the average Wild West saloon? The word comes from the French salon, and it originally had the same meaning, living room, as later on saloon meant hall, especially one on a boat or a train. In 1800s America, it came to meaning public house or bar. Saloons in its establishment originated as a liquor house, as the first saloon was established at Brown's Hole, Wyoming in 1822 to serve fur trappers. By 1880, the growth of saloons was in full swing. In Leavenworth, Kansas, there was about 150 saloons and 4 wholesale liquor houses. Some saloons in the Old West were a little more than casino, brothels, and illegal substance dens. As in the saloons of the Wild West, drinking was certainly a very popular activity, but there was more to it than just alcohol. Saloons often served foods such as a simple meal or snacks to accompany the drinks, as some saloons also hosted entertainment such as live music, dancing, gambling, and even theatrical performances. But the food and drinks weren't always sanitary, as it was rare for one to come across clean water. So drinking whiskey was pretty super common, as well as beer and other forms of alcohol distilled. But aside the yeehaw and crime and punishments, there was also a lot of weird things in the Wild West that aren't as jarring, like how your bed would be full of squirrels. And I'm not saying like alive squirrels, although maybe. Some of the dead squirrels that they would find would be helpful to stuff your bed to be a little softer when you stayed the night. Also, everyone smelled bad, really bad, considering there wasn't any forms of pipes or running water for miles, as water would be stagnant in the water towers and not a lot of filtration was made. The acidic and boracic acid smelling water would linger not just on you, but also on your clothes. If you were lucky, you might be able to bathe maybe once a week, as it took some time as well to warm up your bathtub, as heated water wasn't also available for the times. Other than these type of cleaning hygienics like bathing, when it came to oral care like brushing your teeth, people in the Old West used a variety of methods to clean their teeth. Some common practices include a toothbrush made out of animal hair or plant fibers, and brushing with a mixture of water and baking soda or salt. Chewing on twigs or rough cloths to rub their teeth were also very common methods, as health care like oral dental care often meant tooth extractions, as other aspects were pretty much a privilege of what we're having today that did not exist back then. As well as going to the outhouse was a more common thing than going to one in the saloon, as it would have probably stunk up the establishment and prevented customers from arriving. But that still didn't prevent people to do what the French did, which is to pee in a corner. So in the Old West, people would use a variety of materials for toilet paper, including leaves, corn cobs, newspapers, and even old catalog pages. Soft, commercial produced toilet paper, as we are very privileged to know today, didn't become very widely available until the late 19th century. And since they didn't have plumbing, as these outhouses were so common and gross, they stunk as they attracted many types of wildlife to slither their way in with you. They had bugs like black widows, and if you're extra unlucky, maybe even poisonous snakes. Also, because of the trades of goods of many were tobacco, spittoons were located everywhere. In almost every saloon, if not, you'd be finding yourself slipping on someone else's spit. Due to the widespread of the chewing tobacco in the 19th century, spittoons were a common fixture in public areas, including railroad stations. Their intended purposes was collecting tobacco juice spit from a distance, so typically they were built heavy and low to the ground. So with a wide mouth or funnel top, in the United States, public health departments launched an anti-spitting campaign to stop the spread of TB as it became more and more aggressive in smaller populated areas. Tuberculosis had forced some of these states as spitting to be illegal, as it still is, and by the mid-20th century, spittoons were finally gone from most public spaces in the United States. I don't really think right now they still have spittoons, but that's gross. Even the towels used to clean the bathroom and the bars at saloons were the same towels you'd wipe your face if you had too much beer foam. People kept spitting, and so it was so outlawed that because of the respiratory disease went rampant in the regions, if you kept spitting, you'd be charged with a $500 fine. But either way, the Wild West, from the daily politics to hygienes, times do be changing and the world keeps on spinning. With gambling as super apparent in saloons as it was also useful pastime, it was also a risk if you were a cheat, and you might also have to cheat death, because you're not supposed to do that. Some, like the weapon fight at the OK Corral, were the outcome of long long-simmering feuds and rivalries, but most were the result of confrontation between outlaws and law enforcement. Although in movies, televisions would like to us believe otherwise, it was very rare when pew-pew fights occurred with the two standing fighters off squarely facing one another from a distance in a dusty street. They would just knock your butt out. The romanticized image of the Old West style fight was born in the dime novels of the late 19th century and perpetuated in film era to make such a point that this fiction version of what our mind's eye quickly conjures up when we hear the word weapon fight. You know what I mean. In actuality, the real fights of the Old West were actually so rarely civilized that yes, we might have heard some of these famed robber criminals like sharpshooters like Billy the Kid, Calamity Jane, Jesse James, and Annie Oakley. They wouldn't really wait. Unlike Clint Eastwood films. It was probably more rotted than it was organized, and the Wild West saloons were also known for its culture of its violence. Weapon slingers and outlaws, as I mentioned, often frequent these establishments, and disputes were often settled with a handheld weapon fight. Even saloon owners would also provide their own weapons for their patrons, and saloons itself would become a battleground during an open firefight. Saloons would also appear in every town and were your average pit stop on a long journey, and if you're a man who hasn't seen or felt the touch of a woman in a very long time, and you can afford it, you might stop by to a certain saloon for a drink and quench whatever thirsty self you might be craving. Like a gentleman's club, most Wild West saloons catered almost exclusively to the white men in the frontier, although women could sometimes find work in the bars as dance hall girls or workers of the evening. But of course you have the madam of the house making sure the security of her girls are okay, but when it comes to money and gold rushes, it was pretty much more valuable than the average person's life. Respectable women didn't frequent Wild West saloons, but women who were less concerned about their reputations might find work there. Many saloon girls were widows and had no other means of support, or young girls who were seeking something more than working on their family farm. They wanted adventure, if you know what I mean. The girls were to dance with the men and get the men to buy them drinks, earning as much as $10 per week, which is pretty a lot for back then. Most saloon girls also made commissions from the drinks they sold, and whiskey sold to the customers were generally marked up to 30 to 60% over its wholesale price. But like all dames who worked in these type of eras, were definitely in her bag, as her status would be noted and gossiped throughout town. One famous saloon girl was also named Fanny Porter. Fanny's family arrived in Texas when she was just 1 year old, immigrating from England. Growing up as both an immigrant and the middle of the Wild West may have inspired her to enter the sporting life, as she took up the trade as a teenager and opened up her own brothel at the age of 20 in San Antonio. In some ways though, these saloons would have been another term for these women of the night to rebrand themselves as cantina girls. However, despite themselves and the services they provide, their life expectancies were actually short. In a typical night, and I'm not just talking about in case, someone does something to them, it was because of the drinking. A woman may have to have consumed up to 30 beers a night. An average lifespan of a woman in the cantina trade was less than a decade. Like as in current times in Japan, they also have these host clubs that if you go and meet these very handsome and beautiful people, you would also be forced to drink with them. And like the cantina girls back in the Wild West, a lot of these people would suffer a lot of liver issues, which means cantina girls still exist today, just not where we are well known of. And since I mentioned it was so dirty, they'd even bring their horses in the saloon. Like the idea of the Wild West and anyone could do anything they want. That also included bringing your horse inside of the bar to take a selfie with. Like in this photo, where the men of the saloon located in Utah took their horse to be part of the group chat profile pic. And I think my favorite part of this photo is how the bartender is also posing. But despite how gross it was back then, even part of the historical tourist attractions, there are some saloons still open and even in operation today. Saloons like the White Elephant in Fort Worth, Texas, was one of the more than 60 Wild West saloons in the city, and at the end of the 19th century, it is actually still open today for functioning, albeit in a different building. But it still holds a lot of significance as it holds a lot of memento, part of American Western history.
Number 10. Boot Hill Burials. In the Old West, many towns had a boot hill, which was essentially a graveyard where outlaws and bandits and all those bad people alike were all buried with their boots on. Specifically with those on right there. See, these cemeteries were often lacking proper markings, and the dead were buried quickly, sometimes a little too quick without a coffin, reflecting the harsh and lawless nature of frontier life. It wouldn't be abnormal to see a boot sticking up out of the ground on your way home from work, is what I'm saying. Today that would be quite jarring, but back then, completely normal. How yucky is that? I'm like, oh, size 11.5? Perfect. Number 9. Medical practices. In the Old West, broken bones were a common occurrence. Obviously, uneven roads, hopping up and down horses, everything's made of wood that's all broken. Particularly among those who worked in physically demanding professions such as ranchers, miners, and cowboys, everything is going to be broken on your body by the end of the day. Treatment options were limited and often relied on basic first aid techniques, splinting the affected area with whatever materials were available. Wood, cloth, animal bones. It was nuts. It sounds crazy, but back then, it was really the only method for immobilizing broken bones. You have to wrap another bone around it. It's like, ew, please, can I get a cleaner bone? Pain relief was only provided with natural remedies such as opium or willow bark tea, so 50-50 what kind of night you're gonna have there. More serious fractures, such as those that punctured the skin, ow, those required the attention of a doctor or a surgeon. However, back then the doctor had like 2 teeth in one eye, so not much help. Number 8, duels. Yes, duels. Let's talk about these. Duels, gotta say it all deep like. Duels were a common way to resolve disputes. Before YouTube comments, this was the only place to resolve any conflict, alright? In a traditional old Western duel, opponents would face each other, often with weapons, in front of a crowd at a designated location and time. Now, most of the time, these duels would end when somebody bites the bullet. Rarely would a duel end with 2 gentlemen shaking hands, getting over their disagreements. No, never happened. These confrontations, often over matters of honor, were deadly and a normalized part of the culture. Number 7, law enforcement. That being said, back in the day, things were a little different. Not that many body cam back in those days, I'll tell you that for free. With a lack of formal law enforcement, communities often took justice into their own hands. They're like, oh yes, all 17 of us, we've decided, you're out of here. Vigilante coups would form to hunt down suspected criminals, often resulting in brutal forms of punishment without a formal trial. Yeah, no judges needed, no jury duty, nothing like that. The town ended the conflict in 48 seconds. You're welcome, let's get a beer. Let's get a really disgusting beer. Number 6, public punishments. Now, when I say the town handled it, this is what I mean. We gotta go into detail here, because that's why I'm here. Public hangings were often treated as a social event, with crowds gathering to watch as if it were entertainment. How disgusting is that? They were dressed to the nines, they grabbed the whole family. People would come from miles around, sometimes with picnics, to witness this brutal punishment. Yeah, picnic. What food do you pack for a hanging? Nothing with a crunch, that's for sure. You don't want to ruin the show for the people around you. Sorry. Number 5, banking. Today, online banking is super easy, but back in the old West days, you didn't get a courtesy email, you didn't have overdraft, nothing like that. In fact, the United States national banking system didn't even exist until 1863. So what happened before then? Are we just hiding our money in our underwear? What are we doing? Before then, you'd have what were called Wildcat banks. And these Wildcat banks would take deposits for a short amount of time, and then unannounced, out of nowhere, they would run. They would disappear overnight with all of your money, everything, your whole life savings. Gone. They did the long con. They played the long game. They were actors. So you're telling me they pretended to be bankers for months at a time? That's almost impressive. They'd have the fake mustache. Oh, good morning, sir. Sign here, please. They lied. They faked it for months. They just lied for months and then dipped out of nowhere. Thankfully, after 1863, a noble profession was to work at a bank and, not steal everybody's money. The Hudson Bay Company, Wells Fargo, these big names, they all gained trust over time because of these fake Looney Tune banks. Imagine, how do you not break character? You're like, okay, and that's you all set up. They're like, we got it, go. Number 4, seam squirrels. Nothing to do with squirrels before you get upset. Here we go. During the Old West era, personal hygiene was not a priority for many people, and lice infestations were all too common. Nice, now I'm itchy doing this list, love that. The type of lice that affected people during this time was commonly known as body lice, which could be, well, obviously found in the seams of clothing, hence the term seam squirrels. I got some squirrels on my body, nice, that's great, so itchy, so disgusting. Body lice was a major problem during the Old West era, and they were responsible for the spread of diseases like typhus, trench fever, relapsing fever, all the fevers, any fever just coming your way, right into your mouth and eyes, horrible. These diseases were often fatal, and many people in the Old West succumbed to them. So to combat the spread of lice and the diseases that they carried, people in the Old West often resorted to extreme measures, such as burning their clothing or even shaving their heads completely bald. Bunch of bald cowboys. Bunch of naked bald cowboys walking around being like, where's my money? I thought this was a bank. Number 3, resurrectionist. While Boot Hill sees folks going into the ground, a resurrectionist was responsible for The exact opposite. Yeah, bring him back up. We actually made a mistake. Get that guy back out of there. These guys were responsible for digging up dead bodies, and then they would sell them to medical schools for like $9. It was really disgusting. Now, this was the late 1820s, and at this time in Edinburgh, Scotland, believe it or not, the medical science community was on the up and up, so this was needed for that to work. But in order to study new medicines and, avoid the next plague, they needed these guys. They needed these resurrectionists to rise the dead, like they're a White Walker in Game of Thrones. I don't know, that's what I imagine in my head. Would you rather work a Boot Hill type job, or would you rather get paid to dig up bodies? Put them in or take them out? Comment down below. Both are so horrible. Couldn't imagine picking. Number 2, bad bartenders. When we think of old saloons, the old Western saloons, kicking in those crazy doors, we imagine some catchphrases and whiskey and all that fun stuff. Everyone's loud, it's Peaky Blinders, whatever. No, not at all. It was the exact opposite of fun. The bartender would pour a drink, the cowboy would take the bottle instead because he's an alcoholic, and also that's super illegal. Back in the Wild West days, you could do whatever you want. You could drink what you want, you could serve what you want. Anything goes. Bartenders also had no regulations to follow behind that sketchy bar. So not only was it very high proof, but some bevies like tarantula juice would just straight up kill you. Yeah, if its name didn't tip you off, if you're drinking tarantula juice, it's because it's made with poisonous ingredients. Tarantula juice was made from strychnine, and if you drink it, well, you'll feel like there's tarantulas crawling all over your skin. Huh, how fun is that? Cool. Which button do I press to not tip? Thanks so much. Number 1, medical shows. Today, medical shows are fascinating. Even on YouTube, Dr. Pimple Popper, are you kidding me? I can gag all day and watch that, it's the best. Back in the Wild West, the 1860s to the 1890s specifically, they had what's called medicinal showmen. Now these guys, these showstoppers, they would show up in your town selling elixirs and tonics because everyone needed one, of course. Everyone needs to live a happy and comfortable life, but they were full of lies. Don't listen to these guys, all right? These professional medicinal showmen would have pawns run ahead, stay in your town, and then wait. They would plant themselves in the audience before these random demonstrations of amazing medical elixir shows began. So they'd call up random audience members, one of these being their buddy, and then these magical elixirs would treat their ailments just like that. What an amazing show. I'm in. I'm gonna buy this immediately. One of the most successful of these elixirs was the elixir made from John Healy and Charles Bigelow. It was a mixture of herbs, roots, and animal fat, and it was said to treat any illness back in the day. But in reality, it was an extremely strong laxative. So imagine finding that out on the way home. You're like, hey, I'm exploding out of my body. What's going on? I don't think that worked back there.